one of the themes that perhaps Zach and I are, certainly I am preoccupied with is, things aren't going well with our standard approaches to drugs and alcohol, and everybody knows that. Nobody thinks we're doing well preserving lives in terms of substance use. Everybody knows that tons of people use substances, but people can't bring those two ideas together and formulate a way of living with substances. That's something people feel that way. People continue to push the same old approaches of AA and abstinence and the 12 steps. And so the question that I want to ask is, how is it that we fail to deal with telling the truth? And so a whole other preoccupation of mine is, how do you get the truth out there? How do you get individuals and groups to acknowledge the truth? And so a title I'm working with for that is To Tell the Truth, which has a double meaning. And the double meaning is this: how can you tell what is true? And that we're preoccupied with that, of course, society-wide. We're aware that in Russia, they just tell people, we're helping the Ukrainians out. 80% of Republicans think that the election was fake. And so the idea that there's a truth, has really been challenged. Now, I should make clear, I believe in truthfulness. I believe in empiricism and rationality. Mm-hmm. Those are things that I believe in. But I believe that reality is not the basis of both people's truth detection. People detect the truth mainly by the people around them. Mm-hmm. And the simplest thing to say is they'll believe what everybody else around them tells them is the truth.
And we're on the same beam, and got there different ways, I'm sure, because we don't really talk about this super often. But when I started the other podcast that I do, the Social Exchange, that was exactly the reason why I wanted to do it. I noticed what a bubble I sort of lived in and the things that I believe. I noticed I'm not allowed to grant any sort of, I can't grant anybody who has an opinion that's not part of my milieu's general opinion. And I found that interesting. So the whole basis for that was, okay, invite people on to talk about things that might be wrong, might be true, but are people seeking the truth? And at least what you can do, I think, I know, hopefully this feeds in well. You don't always know the truth. You just kind of know what you're supposed to believe, but you can at least not lie. And I think people get caught up in believing things that they know rationally aren't true. I saw some of the examples you might give in a moment, so that's what made me think of that.
I think people can go crazy being aware of what's true and everybody else is wrong. The guy who discovered microbe theory and germ theory was a man who died in a mental institution.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Semmelweis. And women got infected and died in a German birthing hospital. And he said, what if we get the doctors to wash their hands and follow prophylactic procedures, that'll stop. And it stopped. And so you figure he had a pretty good case, but they said he's crazy because they didn't know about germs. This is way back in the 1840s or 50s. Now people think, oh, they were so dumb then. But that exact same process takes place every day now. And what I talk about it To Tell the Truth in both big ways and small ways. But let me just start with a couple of primary stories that have occurred in our lifetimes, which are unbelievable. I mean, the most famous rip-off artist of our time, until lately, was Bernie Madoff, the financier who executed the largest Ponzi scheme in history, tens of billions of dollars. And, you know, it's not too complicated to describe it. He didn't actually invest money. He took a lot of money in, and then he kept recruiting new clients, and then he paid out a high level of fixed response, and he claimed, well, I was just making very successful investments. Now, the thing about Madoff was he had been a pioneer in electronic trading, and he was the chair of NASDAQ in the early 90s. So he's not, you know, some of these Ponzi scheme guys are like, you know, they come in off the street and they're magicians.
So he had some credibility going into the scheme, into the bait and switch.
He did. So here's a man who claims he's able to return 15% on investments, even when the stock market goes up or the bond rate goes down. And just off the top of your head, that's impossible. So a side story of the Madoff ripoff is that there's a privileged group of people, and you had to have a certain amount of money to invest in, who said, well, why wouldn't I be in a group that always makes money? That sort of is a logic that works for them. How can you be making 15 or 18% when everyone else is making less money? Now, there's something called the Securities Exchange Commission. And they supposedly have been investigating him for 20 years. And they never, you know, they were allowed to go into his offices and he had no investment. He had a back room where they made up financial reports. That's what they did. But I'm interested in people who tell the truth. So I have a bunch of heroes. And there was some gadfly financial analyst called Harry Markopoulos. And he began showing, you know, it's not hard to prove that what Bernie Madoff claimed to be doing was impossible. He didn't have to use advanced analytic techniques. He said, well, let's run through these scenarios. How is he turning out 15% when the market dropped 5% and everybody else lost? And nobody's ever had straight years of all this kind of productivity. And so Markopoulos would go out and say, this is impossible. Madoff is lying. And he would file reports with these calculations to the SEC. And everybody thought Markopoulos was some kind of nut. SEC simply ignored him. And now at the tail end, you know, he was ripping off poor old people. His son committed suicide. You know, he ripped off charities. He took away people's nest eggs. There were serious, well, his son committed suicide. There were serious consequences, death included. And yet nobody ever put two and two together, even though it was staring them in the face. How is that possible? And one answer to that question is, Madoff was a great salesman, and one thing he would always do is he'd say, oh, you have to convince me to let you into my investment. Guys like that are always great salespeople. But think about it. An obvious fraud and an agency with a bunch of analysts whose job it is to review these kinds of things. And one guy comes in and says, look, here's just some numbers. It can't happen. And they all are duped. You've got to get your head into that. But there's been a more recent example of that, which is beyond belief. And you're at people who view this, lucky few, are going to hear something that's even beyond belief, that's not shown. There have been a number already of documentaries made about Elizabeth Holmes.
Oh yeah, so interesting.
Their book's been written. There's a series right now, The Dropout, on Hulu.
So if we close the door on Bernie Madoff for now, it's safe to say that there's a large swath of people. I mean, people were begging him to invest their money, even when it seemed like there's something fraudulent going on. The people who are claiming fraudulence, or what are they deemed? You're a conspiracy nut. You're upsetting the apple cart. That kind of a thing.
Oh, the people who
people who tried to expose him, who nobody even took seriously.
It's not that many people that tried to expose, except real investment firms. In this case, didn't believe him, but nobody wanted to go head to head with him,
right?
Because he had such influential backers. And Mercopolis is a nobody. For some reason, there's a certain number of people. It's like the king's not wearing any clothes.
Right.
You're counting on that to happen. And Elizabeth Holmes is an even better example. It's Elizabeth Holmes, that people don't understand that. So Elizabeth Holmes developed Theranos, a blood testing company, and it could do all kinds of blood tests in a machine by doing a simple pinprick.
Mm-hmm.
And from the get-go, there were people that said, that's impossible. Given So there were people that doubted that from the get-go. And it was never subjected to outside review or evaluated by the FDA. And yet she got millions and millions of dollars in investment. And her board of directors, it just looked like, George Shultz, a former Secretary of State, General Mattis, just an incredibly high prestige group of people. Henry Kissinger were on her board, and they all loved her. And this went on to a really, really bad place where, despite never demonstrating that they could do what they said they were doing, they went out to Walgreens and started selling their tests. They didn't actually even do most of the tests. They actually sent the tests out to regular blood testing places. Their machines never worked, never. They couldn't even do a demo that worked. They would fake demos. And they went out to Walgreens and they generated almost 1 million results a year between 2013 and 2015, and they're virtually random. And so in the documentary, they'll show, some woman being told that her cancer's recurred, but it's almost like they made that up. How did they do that? So one thing, they were famous for their secrecy. Communications were forbidden even among their staff. And all employees were required to sign non-disclosure agreements. And a character that's going to appear in this story, we might get sued, is David Boies. Do you know who David Boies is?
No.
He's a super duper famous lawyer. He fought for the Democrats in the Florida election fight. He fought for gay marriage in California, so he's a superstar. And his most recent endeavor was he represented one of the women assaulted by Epstein, and especially by the prince, Andrew.
Right.
So he's a hero again. But you don't make it, he'll get a third of whatever he got for her. So that'll work out for him. You don't make a ton of dough doing that gay marriage thing and election thing. David Boies represented Harvey Weinstein, and David Boies was on the board. He was the attorney but he was also on the board of Theranos. So, for example, one of the people he had some real scientists working on it. He had a British chemist working on it. And he committed suicide. And so there are copies. David Bowie sent letters to his widow saying, if you make a peep about it, they usually give you some money. If you make a peep about this, your life will be miserable. We're going to get into that.
I do remember this. Yeah.
So how did Elizabeth Holmes succeed? She had a great rap. She hated blood testing, phlebotomy. It's the only thing I'm afraid of. And look at all the lives we could save. I mean, it's a great story, if only it were true.
Well, it's a great story, and some people, for various reasons, needed it to be true. Like even seemingly trivial reasons, like she's a woman in business. That would be like a progressive kind of a value that she takes on. And I think she took on back.
We like to say, "Oh, look at those crazy Republicans who don't think the election worked."
Right.
Progressives are just as liable. A young woman. I don't like the title of the series, The Dropout. That makes it sound like, well, I mean, obviously she's calling attention to the fact that Steve Jobs dropped out. So, I'm not against drop. If you decide you got a better way to go than college, okay. But everybody wanted her to, and that comes out. And it comes out in the most amazing place. She joined the Harvard Medical School Board of Fellows. They begged her to join. And something you won't see in any of the media, but which I'm going to include in my work, Jeffrey Flyer, the distinguished professor of physiology and medicine, the dean of the Harvard Medical School, invited her to join the Harvard Medical School Board of Fellows, which are like guys who are going to win the Nobel Prize. You know what I mean? They're not. We were all getting back to how did she work this? We were always looking out for new members who would add value to the group. We saw greater youth, a record of entrepreneurship, even better if it was in the domain of health. And we were conscious of the value of gender balance. Gosh, I hope we don't get accused of like being anti-gender or something here. But they said she's perfect. We need her. So here at the time, she'd already been performing this fraud, and not even the test never demonstrated that they worked for years. And she's invited. And of all the strange things that happen, he describes interacting with her and inviting her. During our lunch at Harvard Faculty Club, she gave me the Theranos pitch, which she's great at. We're going to bring healthcare to people's homes. We're going to make it easy for people to be healthier and live longer. And while it was predictably, this is the dean of the Harvard Medical School, and a man is not a fool. It was very transformative, but I kept pushing back on several issues. Her response to my queries was disappointingly bland. And in retrospect, I should have accorded these concerns more weight. On the very morning that she formally joined the Harvard Medical School Board in October 2015, the Wall Street Journal published an article by a man named John Carreyrou, who lives in Brooklyn, describing Theranos as being a fraud. So she's actually at this board meeting, and people are rifling through the Wall Street Journal. And Elizabeth Holmes has been convicted of fraud, by the way. Let's jump to in Brooklyn, at federal court. And she wasn't convicted because she gave false tests to those poor suckers, some of whom were really maimed by it. It was mainly wire fraud and fraudulent fraud perpetrated on investors. The bad news is the patients are still out in the cold. And she's going to jail. So she coolly went through 2 days of board meetings But then afterwards they said, we have to remove her. And then Theranos didn't shut down after that article by Cariou for another 2.5 years. And now until 2018, and now just now they went on trial in 2021, her and her partner, for fraud.
Now, and it's always, we talked about Thomas Insel, the psychiatrist, last time we spoke, and it's always in retrospect, understanding and telling the truth in the moment would have been better. He retired and said, you know what, after all this time, psychiatry doesn't really work. Or, in retrospect, in this case, I could have told you that some of this stuff is fraudulent.
And let's just look at the data. Let's just roll out the data. There is reality. And the Harvard Medical, they have a lot of people at the Harvard Medical School, men and women, who knows that what she was claiming, A, didn't work, and who know that B, it was never subjected to objective scrutiny. So here's the question. How the hell did a Wall Street Journal reporter named John Cariou figure it out while all those, I hate to say it, geniuses at the Harvard Medical School couldn't? Why did Cariou figure it out and they couldn't?
Because he had sort of the right of way to do it as a journalist, I guess. I mean, he's looking for something interesting in the story. I mean, he's looking at it on an outside perspective. He's not bought into it for some reason, right? Is that what you mean?
And there are two other things going on. John Cariou is half French. And when they interviewed him, he says something like, Americans are kind of gullible. If you really sell them a good, we're a little more cynical. I mean, he's an American. He sounds American, but I think his father he grew up in France. And he's an investigative reporters have a different mindset. So every time she gives the same speech all the time, she gave a TED speech, she gives the same speech every time about how this is going to be transformative, how people don't like it, it's going to bring health to people. And she never talked about any kind of a technical thing. So Cariou's watching this, and he's not a scientist, but he's saying, well, she's not describing a single thing about how it actually works scientifically.
Right.
Or anybody who outside of it. She was convicted for fraud because, what I'm getting at is even the jury might have been confused if some people said, well, she kept giving bad results. What she got convicted of was she sent out lures for investors on stationery from the major drug companies, which they didn't write. She put it, and so that's, everybody gets that. Wait a second, you're not allowed to claim, that's wrong. So Cariou was threatened by boys, and I'm going to say something positive about somebody that nobody says. Do you know who? Boys threatened the widow of Theranos scientist Ian Gibbons, who committed suicide, because he's like a regular scientist, and he knew that he killed himself. But Cariou, his reaction, and this is how do you learn to tell the truth? Cariou said, boy, they're really going after me. They're really worried. Most people don't think that way. And we'll get into who thinks that way. And I do have to give a shout out. Do you know who Rupert Murdoch is?
Yeah,
he owns
all the press pretty much.
He invested $125 million in Theranos. And maybe even he might notice Theranos is worth, less than nothing now. And boys went to the board of Wall Street Journal, and they kept hands off of Cariou. God bless them. There is something left of journalism and integrity. As I said, Cariou would watch her. he kept his eyes on the ball. And he said, well, this is like a sophomore collegiate. She dropped out of her sophomore year at Sarah's. I am half French, and I think Europeans tend to be a little bit more cynical. Americans are eternally optimistic, eternally willing to worship new heroes. Now, there were two people who actually, he only could get two people. Theranos had hundreds of employees, but he could actually only get two people to interview. And they were both young people. One was a woman who got her first job, and she wasn't even she was a technician, not a scientist. And it was tearing her guts out because she saw that the machines didn't give proper results. And then the craziest thing of all, George Shultz had a grandson who got an internship. And he likewise saw that it was all BS. This part of the story is so, kind of incredible. The woman's name was Chung, and his grandson's name, I don't, let me see, where was, I'm missing his first name here. But Schultz's the young guy came from a privileged family, and boys went after him tooth and nail. His family ended up spending $500,000 in legal fees. So one answer to the question of why don't people ever blow the whistle is because they're scared shitless. David Boys and legal firms can kill you. And then that woman, Chung, she's like the hero of the century. Mm-hmm. She's not rich. And they threatened her too. And in the actual trial, the defense would say, well, all these big scientists that work for us said it was working. Who are you? And that's the question. How is some young 20-something person with an undergraduate degree going to say, I don't care what they say, I saw it didn't work. By the way, there's a very famous experiment in science by a German immigrant, Solomon Asch.
The shock experiment?
Not the shock experiment.
Okay.
It was, they'd have 12 people in a room and 11 of them were paid Confederates. And they put two pictures of a stick on board. And then they'd say, which one is longer? And all 11 would say the short one is longer.
Yes.
And 90% of people who weren't being paid agreed.
Guess I'm just an idiot. Yeah.
And the funny thing is that the people who disagreed were incredibly anxious. The guy say, yeah, well, if you're sitting in a room and 11 people say, well, that sticks longer, it takes like an incredible urge of honesty to say, and they would start sweating and say, I hate to disagree with everybody in the room. Maybe there's something wrong with my eyes, and you doubt yourself. And who wants to stand? Nobody. And so, but that one's shorter. And so this young woman had to have the guts to stand up to people and say, yeah, I don't care what these PhDs are saying, for whatever reason, it didn't work. I went in there and the results, the machines didn't work and the results didn't work. So, and the grandson, there's some aspects of this that are, along with the dean of Fryer of Harvard Medical School, George Shultz liked Eleanor Holmes and invited her to her house over the holidays, and he stopped inviting his grandson. And when his grandson came in to try to explain to him, Eleanor Holmes is one of those people that tells half truths. What part of her rap was, if we could include these things in medevac helicopters. Wouldn't that be great? And so George Shultz tells his grandson, well, they're using it in medevac helicopters. And his grandson says, well, no, they're not. That's not happening. The Department of Defense, we might not think much of them, but they have a process. And so his grandfather stopped inviting him to Christmas dinner. And his parents had to pay a total of $500,000 in legal fees fighting off David Boies. So these stories are beyond belief. And of all of them, the thing that's most beyond belief is they're being invited to the Harvard Medical School Board, where you have people with all the expertise in the world, and she's giving this kind of puff thing, and Caryou's looking at it and saying, well, I've seen, he didn't use the term, I've seen bullshitters before. This is a magic show. So let me just close with how people do that. Did you ever hear of the name Yuri Geller? Do you know who he is?
I have to.
He was an Israeli guy who claimed that he could bend spoons through.
Oh, yeah, I do remember that. And James Randi got it.
Oh, so you know James.
Yeah, I remember that.
And I'm going to have a little ethnic pride here. James Randi was an old Jewish musician from Brooklyn. And so Yuri Geller would come in and he performed in front of groups of scientists, physicists, and he would bend a spoon and they'd say, oh, physicists. But he never bent a spoon when Randy was watching it. What did Randy do? And what Randy would say, always keep your eyes on the guy's hands. That's how it's done. I do these tricks. I could bend spoons, meaning substitute a bent spoon for a regular spoon. And true to form, Randy sued him 3 times. He filed a $15 million lawsuit against Randy for slander. And the statement that Randy made, Geller had tricked even reputable scientists with tricks that are the kind that used to be on the back of cereal boxes when I was a kid. Sued him 3 times. And each time the Amazing Randy, which is a fun name, it's a vaudeville name. So why would, another amazing question is, and this gets back to something you were sort of asking, why would Geller go to court to sue somebody when he's a fakester?
He needs the story to be believed and to be true. It's crucial to his self-preservation and identity. He may even believe it. I don't
know. Why would he run a con game that would have to, his son committed suicide? I mean, it had to be found out at some point. And Elizabeth Holmes did something that Yuri Geller and Madoff didn't do. She testified. And everybody was going, wow, she's got guts. And she never backed down a square inch. Well, she did. They said, this stationery from drug companies, she did say, and she had some explanation. She said, well, a lot of drug companies were interested, but but no, they didn't actually write that letter on that stationery. But everything else, she gave her normal rap, which is transfixing. We need to help people. People don't want to take blood tests and have their veins pierced. We can bring healthcare to individuals and to medevac. And in some way, she had to believe it. And we're getting back to Donald Trump, and we're getting back to Vladimir Putin. They have to believe their story. And so you can't ask the question, do they believe it, or is it true, or do they know they're lying? That question's irrelevant. It's essential. And then you gave the answer, well, why do people they're missing money? The head of the Wall Street Journal, George, these are brilliant men. They had to believe it. The head of the Harvard Medical School, they were transfixed by her. They had to believe her story. She practiced constantly presenting her story. But what is most important is to consider how rare are the critical observers willing to stand up to a wall of information, legal threats, and rejection by peers. So, my heroes that I dedicate the book to are Chung, the younger Schultz, Markopolis. What guts it takes in that Solomon Asch experiment to say, yeah, I don't care if 100,000 people, that stick is shorter than that stick. I don't care if everybody in America says it. And, we have to pay tribute to them at the same time that we, always remember what the amazing Randy said, which is keep your eye on the ball. Did they actually do those tests? Were they actually checked out? She never ran a successful demo. Keep your eye on the ball as opposed to the miasma that surrounds it. And I feel, we're in the addiction business, but I feel that this is so relevant to the story we're telling. In a comparable podcast we're doing for LPP, we talk about how does AA and current treatment approaches fail so much and yet get so much commitment, not only from true believers, but from outside observers who say, well, sure, AA is great, and from investors and from government agencies. How do they sell that ball of wax? And the answers are everybody believes it. Nobody wants to upset the apple cart. It's a good story. And somebody's going to say, oh, my life was saved because I went in here and I went to AA and it saved my life. So they don't look at the overall data. I mean, there's some people who got Theranos tests that were accurate because they were almost random. So you could get people that got up there and say, oh, this really saved my life. It's just that when you look at the overall science of it and the actual results, it was anything but.
You talked about people who identified that line as being shorter, were just uncomfortable. Like somehow they managed to be brave enough to say it, and maybe they were even self-deprecating. Like, look, I must be an idiot, but look, I don't see it. Can you? But there's an exhaustion level too that is associated with telling the truth perpetually. Like you might get a little bit of relief to peel one layer of dishonesty off and just land on some other dishonest, not quite as dishonest level. Like when
you sound like that's happened. It sounds like you've experienced that.
I don't know. I guess I have experienced that. Yes. I wasn't thinking about in terms of myself, but I was actually turning it to you. I mean, I think about, all right, so addiction's not genetic, fine, but hey, can't we just agree like mental illnesses, ADHD is genetic, so in a way it is. And so it's like, okay.
Another example, people come to me and they say, oh, I agree with you 100%, alcoholism is not a disease. Really, alcohol was a response to a misdiagnosis, while I was depressed or a manic depressive, I had that disease.
Right.
And they gave the wrong diagnosis to that disease. Or you've interviewed the Mad in America guy.
Yeah.
And he has a very distinguished colleague, the former co-editor of the New England Journal of Medicine. And what they say is, oh, these medications aren't working because they create brain lesions. They don't believe that the actual resort to these medications has a negative impact on people's self-efficacy and ability to address directly the kinds of problems that are causing them anxiety and depression. So the people that you're sympathetic to, and I get interviewed for these kinds of things, and I have to say, well, I'm not going up that tree either,
Yeah.
Sorry. Even
What
the
is his
people
name?
don't like me,
I was able to back him into a corner on a statement that he made until he sort of admitted, okay, what you're saying is true. He was talking about cannabis causing psychosis. And I said, I asked, can you, just given what this show is, people are going to be mad at me if I don't apply pressure here. Sorry. And I have a clip of this. What do you mean marijuana causes psychosis? You're talking about data and following the evidence, but do you mean that sometimes people get high and then they act weird, and then when they get into the hospital, they get diagnosed with some sort of psychotic disorder, but even though it was temporary? Because that's what I mean. Yeah, sure, they're misconstruing an incident for a long term, but then he goes on just to tell the same story. I mean, it goes on to explain that marijuana causes psychosis.
Or the other obvious answer is, suppose somebody smokes marijuana around the clock. What's that tell you about marijuana? Most people don't smoke marijuana around the clock.
Right.
Same thing with alcohol. What's the explanation for that? And then you can give, well, I don't believe in the medical model. I believe in the medical model. Yep. It's not that the marijuana does it or the alcohol does it. It's their genes makes them do it.
Right.
It's sort of like shifting, going back to the Amazing Randy, watch them shift their hands. You know what I mean? Bam, ba, bam, ba, bam, ba, bam, bam, bam. And we can never get down to confronting the kind of truth about people, their lives, their ability to change, their presence of resilience or not presence, how we encourage resilience. And so that's why the underlying, I mean, it didn't matter how much Elizabeth Holmes got people to invest, those machines didn't work. You couldn't make them work. Bernie Madoff didn't do investments. No matter how much you believed in it and wanted to believe in it, you couldn't make that work. Yuri Geller, people can't bend spoons by cognitive, sending out brainwave. It doesn't work. And, shifting explanations isn't what it's all about. It's just saying, well, that doesn't work. It's not true. So, those are my heroes. And God bless them all, and a lot of times, like Markopoulos is like a really awkward guy, and Schultz couldn't go to Christmas dinner, and Chung was like, had to undergo grilling by people saying, well, all these top scientists said it worked. Well, who are you? So we tip our hat to them.
All right, I have one more question for you. It might sound obvious, but I don't think it's so obvious. The turtles all the way down thing. What is the Earth? It's just we're on the back of a turtle shell. Well, what's holding up the turtle? It's another turtle, and it's turtle. All right. Well, if you have a herd that believes in that, most people, as you say, are going to run with the herd, and even if it's nonsense. Just all right, because if you run against the herd, you might get trampled.
Right.
But if you're running against the herd, you might also just be an honest person, and honesty is a value. It's essential. But why? Why do you think, especially if only the next generation might benefit from your honesty, Stanton, why is it important to you that you remain honest despite the disadvantages of
you're asking that question because you have a dog in that fight. Outgrowing addiction is over your left shoulder. And in there, we write something like, for no other reason do we want to talk about the fact that people overcome addiction on their own. We just want to tell the truth. We just want to do that. And maybe we're naive fools. And I don't know who to blame. You, in your case, I don't know how you came up to be a truth teller, but we're both human beings that when we see something, we place it inordinate value on just saying what's actually true. And we value people who are truth tellers. We look for people who will say something that's actually true as opposed to just going along with the herd. And, it's bad enough that we're patting ourselves on the back for just telling the truth, but it's remarkable how difficult and how rare it is. And in some, there are people in the Ukraine and Russia, the guy he's in jail the whole time. First they tried to poison him, the opposition leader.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's many times in history where to tell the truth is to risk death and torture. In those situations, I'd probably back up myself, but I'm really bad at doing that. And, you could view that, somebody could argue that's a lack of a social skill. And so, you and I have both had our moment, we deal with that differently, but it's a value we both have and that we try to convey to those near and dear to us. And I'm getting to the end of my career. I'm going to float out on that funeral pyre with that set of values. You've yet to confront a couple of decades worth of fighting that battle.
Well, amen for common sense and truth.
And to Chung and Schultz and Carry You.